Wow. We have had the distinct honor of not only hosting Juan Zarate here this evening, but certainly about 2 months ago. We, as you all hopefully received, an email asking for questions in which we can pose to Juan. And he's
You're going to take the hard ones, right?
And totally. And I get to facilitate those questions. So for the next, I would say, 10 minutes, we're going to be asking some really hard questions that have come to us from all of you. So thank you. The first question that I actually want to ask you is, you talked a lot specifically about the international terrorism threat and the international security cooperation that has gone a long way with respect to this country. But can you explain how terrorist attacks in Sweden, India, Africa, and elsewhere actually impact the United States and in communities such as Denver? What gets the attention of Department of Homeland Security, and how does it impact the way local law enforcement prepares and responds to situations?
Great question. I don't think any terrorist attack can be viewed in isolation for two reasons. One, the terrorist groups that are operating, be they Sunni extremists, Shia extremists, in some ways are rogues of the international system. What they're looking to do is to terrorize the international community, whether it be in Sweden or Africa or in the United States. And so in some ways, they are part of a movement that views as legitimate the killing of innocent civilians for some purpose, some stated political purpose, and it depends on what group you're talking about. So in a sense, the delegitimation of that is incredibly important to the entire world, because to the extent that people think that it's okay or that it's morally legitimate or theologically defensible to actually attack fellow citizens or citizens of another country or people of a different religion or race, that is harmful, because that creates moral space for people to operate. And I think one of the things that CEL does well is to bring the voices of victims to the issue of terrorism, to say that there are human voices and lives impacted by this. The second reason it relates is that in many cases, not all, but in many cases, these networks interact and interrelate. Take, for example, the Africa example, the Al-Shabaab movement in Somalia, which is ideologically aligned with Al-Qaeda. They're fighting in Somalia for control of the territory. They actually control a good bit of it already. The Department of Homeland Security and the FBI have been quite worried for some time, because there's been a pipeline of American Somali recruits who've been recruited not just in the US and not only been radicalized, but have been mobilized to go fight in East Africa. The first instance of an American suicide bomber was actually an American Somali citizen committing an act of terror in Somalia, blowing himself up. And so the concern is, with a group like Al-Shabaab, which not only is attacking in Somalia, but decided during the World Cup, if folks recall, to attack in Uganda, that it will decide to not only train Americans and Westerners, but will send them back and deploy them to hit in the Mall of America or to hit in a subway somewhere in the United States. And so what may seem to be a very isolated part of the world, and this is what I said, no corner of the world can go ignored, can have very immediate and close to home impact, especially in the 21st century, when it takes half a day to get from someplace like Yemen or Somalia to New York, Denver, or Minneapolis.
Along those lines, I mean, you mentioned, obviously, United States citizens being trained in some rogue states, such as Pakistan, Yemen, Afghanistan, and so on and so forth, and actually bringing it back to here, to the United States. One of our participants here tonight, Leslie Starks, actually asked, how serious do you see the threat of homegrown terrorism here, and how can we best prepare to combat that challenge?
It's a great question, one that's being debated certainly in communities like this, but also in counterterrorism circles in Washington and around the world. In a sense, we have thought of ourselves as relatively immune to the radicalization that Al-Qaeda has spawned. We've seen the problem in Europe quite extensively in places like London and in Denmark and the Netherlands. And in some ways, we have been immune to the wave of radicalization that we've seen. Part of it is, and I may be Pollyannish about this, but I think it's an effect of having a Cuban American and a Mexican American father. I believe in the American dream. And in some ways, the American dream is the counter-narrative to Al-Qaeda's narrative. Now, the problem is you've seen over the last couple of years in particular, more Americans falling prey to this narrative that I talked about and thinking that they now have to participate in attacks against U.S. interests. What's dangerous about what's happening and what we've seen over the last year is not only the volume, because we've seen a lot of these cases now emerge, with the FBI, I think, doing a good job of disrupting, but we've seen Americans willing to kill fellow Americans. The trend in the past had not necessarily been for Americans to view America as a battle space. People would go to fight in Pakistan, or go to fight in Somalia, or go to fight in Yemen. What you've seen, disturbingly, I think, is a tendency for people to start to view their fellow neighbors, the recruitment centers for the military in their communities, as legitimate targets. That's problematic. I would also say that you have the problem of a select group of Americans actually now forming a prominent part in the movement globally. Anwar al-Awlaki, the Yemeni-American cleric, is a part of this group in Yemen. Samir Khan, another American, runs the media arm for the group in Yemen. Adnan Shukajuma now forms part of the core in Pakistan and is in charge of some of the external plotting for al-Qaeda. He's an American. Omar Hamami, one of the jihadi rappers and recruiters in East Africa, is a part of the al-Shabaab movement in Somalia, a kid from Alabama. And so, you have, unfortunately, a trend of more Americans falling prey to the narrative here, some of it via the internet and otherwise, and then some Americans actually devoting their expertise and interest to the organization abroad. And I think that's troubling. That said, I don't think we should overreact. I think there are two things we can do as a community. One, build community awareness, and that means ties into Muslim American communities, communities that may be impacted. That's not only law enforcement, but it's communities writ large, and I think that's critical. The second thing is, I think we need to counter the narrative. We need to remind people what the American dream is about. That narrative is real, and it's that narrative that actually, I think, will ultimately buttress a grand wave of youth in America from falling prey to this, what I consider to be a foreign ideology.
Along those lines, one of the individuals here was talking specifically about civil liberties and that of security, and I think you just started to touch upon it. But obviously, there has been a few allegations by the Muslim leaders who believe that organizations and their religious and cult community centers have been unjustly targeted by the United States government and their surveillance tactics and counterterrorism efforts. Where do we draw the line, and have we crossed that line already?
Well, I think the question of security and civil liberties balance is a critical one, and frankly, I think it's one we should have out in the open often, because I think if there's ever a sense in American society, whether it's in American Muslim communities or otherwise, that there are things happening sub rosa that they're not aware of, and they don't understand the balance. They don't understand why certain steps are being taken. I think that's to the detriment of everybody, because I think ultimately we need citizens who are responsible and who are reacting to the threats we face. In the context of the threat we face, I think we need to be open and honest with each other. And I think the reality is that the greatest threat that we face is from this ideology that pretends to define Muslim identity in a violently exclusionary way, in a way that tries to get people to think of themselves as other, and tries to get them to actually commit acts of violence against those who aren't identified with them. And so I think communities need to be aware of that. And I think actually there's some good news coming out of that. You've seen, for example, in Minneapolis, the American Somali community going to the FBI, going to the Department of Homeland Security saying, we don't want our youth being recruited and sent to die in Somalia. This is a form of kidnapping in a sense, and it's abuse. Help us understand the dynamics. Help us weed out those who are doing this to our sons and daughters, and let us deal with this as a community. And I think at the end of the day, and this is something I've preached since I've been at the White House and now beyond, the ultimate solution to the ideological battle underway globally will come from Muslims themselves. It has to. Theologically, morally, those who profess this extreme ideology have to be isolated, and they have to be seen as extreme, and they have to be seen as enemies of humanity. And that will come in large part from credible voices within Muslim communities.
Along the lines with the White House and your experience in the White House, Is there anything that you can tell us about how we avoided another major incident since 9/11? Are there policy areas that have been successful? Is there anything we can do to support the continuation of these policies? And I'm going to add to that question, which was by William Mutch from the Blanchard Group, by the way. Have there policies that have been proven ineffective and have failed?
Good question, or sets of questions. You know, when I left the White House, I gave 3 speeches as soon as I got out, and my argument was you're going to see fundamental continuity with our counterterrorism policies, in part because the new administration is going to see the world much the same way that we did in terms of the threats. And I think in some ways it's borne out. This isn't meant as a political statement, but I think where the administration has gotten into hot water, whether it's the trial for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed or the closure day for Guantanamo, those decisions have come from political instincts versus the reality of the threats faced. And so I think there's been fundamental continuity, but there's been an evolution of our policy, and I think we have to recognize it. I think one of the things that was critical at an early stage, less important later on, was actually understanding the intelligence picture for al-Qaeda. People forget, and I think it's to our detriment to forget this, how blind the U.S. government felt to the al-Qaeda threat right after 9/11. And I was walking the streets of Washington, D.C. People were literally looking up or looking down the street, expecting the next plane to hit or the next car bomb to go off. People had no idea what al-Qaeda intended, no idea what the network looked like. And so the policies early on were really dictated around the effort to gather as much information and knowledge about the network as possible, and then to disrupt it, to create actionable information to disrupt. So I think our policies in terms of information gathering, disruption abroad, creating layers of defense, trying to undercut the theological, moral legitimacy of this ideology, I think all of that has largely continued in evolution. Some of it has changed, some of it's been pared back. I think where we have failed sometimes is to recognize where our actions or reactions actually feed the enemy's strategic narrative. And so, for example, how we responded to the December 25th failed attack to the enemy appeared to be a complete success. And they've noted that. For example, the group in Yemen has noted that, we tore each other apart in many ways, even though they failed. And so I describe this sometimes in the media as the terrorists somewhat understanding they can throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks, and see where we're going to run next to cover our bases. And so I think that's a lesson we need to learn, and it's a lesson of resilience that, again, we need to learn from the Israelis and others, where we don't overreact, we don't overcommit, and we're rational about how we react to our enemy's actions.
And I'm going to ask you just 2 more questions. You mentioned and you talked a little bit about the WikiLeaks. How does the WikiLeaks events affect our anti-terrorism efforts? How serious of a threat is cyber terrorism, and is our country prepared to handle those threats? Ron Warner, Systems Security Analyst, HDR.
Great questions. Let me take the cyber defense issue first, and then the WikiLeaks issue, because the WikiLeaks issue is a little bit, it's broader in some ways. Cyber defense, I think we are getting better at creating systems that are resilient to cyber attacks, both in the government and the private sector. The challenge for the government, though, and the person who asked the question probably knows this firsthand, is 80% of the cyber infrastructure is in private sector hands. And so the government has a tendency of thinking that it controls the cyber universe when it really doesn't. And I think one of the things that White Houses of both political stripes have tried to grapple with is how do you create resilient cyber systems, digital systems, whether it's for the financial system or for critical infrastructure or just for information flow. How do you do it not just for the government, but how do you do it as a nation? And I think it goes right to the heart of what I was talking about earlier. We have to reconceptualize what it means to be secure, because in many ways our security in the cyber context will be when the private sector feels that it's secure and that it's not subject to attacks either from nation states or vulnerabilities to attacks from cyber terrorists or those who are sort of anarchists on the internet. In terms of WikiLeaks, I think, there was an argument perhaps to be had. I didn't buy it, but there was an argument to be had when the leaks were about our military campaigns, that this was about protest and about legitimate transparency of wars that were deemed to be either illegitimate or unpopular. But I think this latest tranche is basically a data dump on all of our diplomatic activities around the world, and not just historical. I mean, these are current Obama administration efforts, whether it's North Korea, whether it's Iran, whether it's in Middle East peace, whether it's counterproliferation, counterterrorism, work in Yemen. I mean, it's the full slate of things that we're doing on behalf of the American people, but also in terms of our interests. I think it does huge damage to our credibility. First, can the United States keep a secret? Who's going to talk to us now, candidly, not only about bilateral issues, but their impressions around the world? So Chris Hill, for example, who's now a member of the Denver community, he and I were talking about this earlier, and I said to him, it's fairly common in these diplomatic interactions to have a note taker there for the U.S. government, to take notes and to be able to report back to Washington. If I'm a foreign counterpart, there's no way I'm going to allow a note taker to be in there, at a minimum, not to mention the chilling effect on what I'm going to tell my counterpart. So that hurts. Secondly, the United States, despite whatever Julian Assange and his counterparts and compatriots like to think, actually is a force for good in the world, and is seen in these cables is actually trying to solve very hard problems behind the scenes, often quietly. And to the extent that this hurts our ability to not only gather information and to serve as that catalyst for solving these hard problems, that not only hurts the United States government, but it hurts the international community. It's precisely why Secretary Clinton said this is an attack on the international community. I agree with that. And so I think it does huge damage. And I think the last point is it is going to start and I think spark a debate in this country about how it is that people deal with information like this. I mean, we've always had a balance between press freedoms and government secrets dictated by the Constitution and certain understandings. This sort of throws that a kilter a bit. And I think it's going to start a national debate about how to deal with situations like this, which are not only damaging to our national security, but throw off that balance.
The last question that actually comes from Tracy Kesey from the Denver Police Department. How can the federal and local law enforcement work more cooperatively to help citizens understand the need to balance public safety and human rights? And I'm going to add to that, what is the role each individual plays in combating terrorism?
Well, I think the first step is just awareness building. I think people need to be aware, and this group is probably the best example. People here are aware already of the threats we face. Again, how the global affects the local, how the local affects the global. I think in the 21st century, we have to have a citizenry that understands that what happens in places like Afghanistan and Yemen and Somalia, and what happens in Middle East peace affects our security in Denver and Minneapolis and Orange County, where I'm from, in California. So that's critical. It's the awareness building in the first instance. Secondly, I think citizens have to understand how they can be empowered. What opportunities are there to serve? How can they volunteer? How can they be the eyes and ears for the police force? How can they actually serve in a way that's either helpful in awareness building or in terms of response? I think there are huge opportunities for a volunteer cadre to be built in the country around these issues. Finally, I think we have to have more open debates about these balances, civil liberties and security. And the balance won't always be clear. And I think security sometimes should lose out to human rights and civil liberties. I don't think this is cut and dry. And this goes to our understanding of the risks that we face, a balancing of what those risks are, what we're willing to accept or not. This goes all to the pat-down debate for TSA. Is it worth it? Is it worth it given the nature of the threat? The calculus currently is yes. But at some point, the answer may be no. And so we've got to have those debates, and those debates happen at kitchen tables, conferences like this, with lawyers in all sorts of venues, and that actually starts from the ground up in many ways.
Great. Well, Juan, thank you very much. We are honored to have you here tonight. Your remarks were incredibly poignant. You touched on a number of different issues. We're excited to be part of the Urban Area Security Initiative Conference in the coming days and welcome all our guests from around the country and the nation. And one person I didn't recognize because I didn't think he was going to be here tonight, I thought he was going to be in Washington, D.C., was Congressman Kaufman, who actually supports a lot of initiatives between the United States and our partners with Israel. So, Congressman, thank you for coming,
Thank you,
and thank all of you for coming.
Okay.